Dr. Bynum, what is your opinion about Bishop Jakes? Ye that is without sin, cast the first stone. What is wrong with our gospel? If God doesn't save, if God doesn't forgive, if God doesn't go to the guttermost, something is wrong with our gospel. But I want you to think about how nasty you were when God came and got you. I want you to think about all the nasty, dirty, low-down, perverted things that you did when God came and found you. Oh, so why is he only your God? But when somebody else get in trouble, I'm not hearing nobody talk to me.
Big changes at one of the largest churches in Dallas. T.D. Jakes announced today he is stepping down as senior pastor of the Potter's House.
But I wanted to introduce to you your pastors.
After years of quiet, Juanita Bynum has now spoken out, and what she just stated about Bishop T.D. Jakes stepping down is unsettling the whole church world. This isn't simply another goodbye. This is personal. And you won't believe the reality behind her statements, since some claim it's been brewing for nearly 2 decades. When one of the most renowned spiritual leaders of our day, Bishop T.D. Jakes, announced his intention to stand aside, the Christian world was astonished. Dr. Juanita Bynum, a force in her own way, finally broke her silence. And what she had to say wasn't just about his leaving, it was about everything that led up to it. In today's film, we're going deep into the complicated history between Juanita Bynum and T.D. Jakes, from their early days on world stages to the friction that simmered under the surface. We'll discuss what actually occurred, what Juanita just disclosed, and why this moment is greater than a resignation. It's a reckoning. You'll uncover what caused the fallout, the spiritual and personal realities underlying Juanita's message, and why her remarks have resurrected topics many thought were buried. Stay attentive, because this narrative develops like a drama no one saw coming, and by the conclusion, you'll have a whole new viewpoint. For decades, Bishop T.D. Jakes has stood tall as a symbol of spiritual leadership. His sermons were thundering, his books sold millions, and his Woman Thou Art Loosed conferences impacted lives. To the public, he was a giant of religion, an immovable figure who possessed elegance, knowledge, and strength. But beneath the polished sermons and big platforms, Juanita Bynum saw something else, something the public never questioned. You see, Juanita Bynum wasn't simply a casual spectator of Jacques' development. She was part of the movement. In fact, many credit Bishop Jacques for shooting her into prominence when she gave her riveting No More Sheets lecture at one of his large conferences. It was raw. It was genuine. And that was just what millions of women needed. But although the cameras portrayed togetherness, murmurs of conflict started to swirl behind the scenes. According to people close to the incident, Juanita and Bishop Jakes had extremely different notions about ministry, accountability, and the responsibilities of spiritual leaders. While Jakes believed in keeping a certain image and exercising prudence in public situations, Juanita Bynum, always vocal, thought the truth, even when difficult, should never be concealed. And here's when it gets interesting. In private settings, Juanita purportedly voiced worries about what she termed the celebrity culture blossoming in the church. Mega preachers live like moguls, congregations donating mindlessly, lavish gatherings that seemed more like entertainment than spiritual repair. Though she never identified Jakes specifically at the time, sources believe the strain was genuine. So although the world witnessed 2 giants marching in oneness, the truth was more difficult. It was a partnership distinguished by mutual respect, but underlined by developing disparities in values. And when Bishop Jakes announced his resignation from leadership, Juanita Bynum didn't provide the anticipated niceties. She provided truth. Or at least, her truth. But what precisely did she say? And why now after years of silence? Stay with me, because in the following segment, we find Juanita's unedited remarks and what they reveal about the man many considered America's pastor. As the years passed, Juanita Bynum's silence on Bishop T.D. Jakes' leadership and ultimate step-down became a great unsaid weight, until one day she broke that quiet. When Juanita eventually spoke out, her remarks weren't simply a reaction to Jake stepping down. They were a reflection of everything she had seen, experienced, and felt over their years in the limelight. But what was so profound about her message, Juanita didn't only express disappointment or astonishment like many anticipated. She wasn't come to bash or pull down. Instead, she offered something more substantial to the table: clarity. In an honest conversation, Juanita started to explain the behind-the-scenes details about the spiritual empire that many had only seen from the outside. She talked with conviction, unashamedly addressed the truth of what occurs when success becomes all-consuming. Bynum's key message was this: too frequently, spiritual leaders are revered as untouchable idols, and the strain to preserve that image may ruin the very essence of a ministry. As the discussion evolved, it became evident that Juanita wasn't only talking about Bishop Jakes. She was calling out the whole system of celebrity-driven ministries that so frequently deviate away from their genuine mission. People want to be inspired. They want to be healed. But what happens when the healing stops and the image takes over? She asked, leaning into the depth of the issue. At this point in the interview, the weight of her words was clear. She wasn't just reflecting on the decision of Jake stepping down from leadership. She was questioning the very system that had elevated him and others like him to untouchable status. The question she posed, one that struck like a hammer, was, what do you do when your ministry is more about the brand than the calling? This revelation wasn't the dramatic exposure some had expected. There were no explosive accusations or scandalous allegations, but there was something even more powerful: a critique of a culture that had become obsessed with success over service. And this, she said, was why she wasn't surprised by T.D. Jakes' decision to step down. Sometimes people think they can do it all, Juanita continued, but in the end, the pressure will make you crack. The weight of expectation, the isolation of leadership, it'll wear you down. Her message wasn't just about T.D. Jakes. It was a universal message for leaders in all fields, especially those who serve as the spiritual backbone of a community. The expectations placed on them, the demands for perfection, and the silent battles they fight, often unnoticed, can be suffocating. The real shock here wasn't just her words, but the timing. Why had Juanita waited this long to speak out? Had she known about the impending collapse long before the public did? Or did her decision to speak up have something to do with her own evolving journey in ministry and personal growth? As the interview progressed, Juanita further elaborated on the sacrifices that many spiritual leaders face. The fame, fortune, and recognition they enjoy can often come at the cost of their own well-being. In the case of Jakes, it wasn't just about him stepping down. It was about the system that had caused him, and so many others, to feel like they had nowhere to turn. But there was one final unexpected twist. What was the true reason behind his decision to step down? Was it really due to personal exhaustion and a desire for rest, as he publicly stated? Or was there something more that no one had yet dared to say aloud? As the conversation deepened, Juanita Bynum's words began to hold even more weight. What she said next shocked everyone watching. And it wasn't about any public scandal, affair, or betrayal. It was about the soul-crushing realities that no one ever seems to talk about. She paused, gathering her thoughts before dropping the bombshell that no one expected. It wasn't just about the fatigue or the public pressure. T.D. Jakes' decision to step down was a necessary break from a ministry that had become a monster. Juanita's statement hung in the air, and for a moment, the interviewer and the audience were left speechless. What exactly did she mean by that? To understand the gravity of Juanita's statement, you first have to consider the nature of Bishop Jakes' ministry. Over the years, his ministry had expanded far beyond the walls of the church, evolving into a global empire. T.D. Jakes was no longer just a pastor. He was a brand, a public figure, a mogul with a reach that stretched into television, publishing, and even film. But as Juanita pointed out, with great power comes great cost. In her eyes, the empire that had been built around Jakes wasn't sustainable. It wasn't just the exhaustion of being in the spot, it was the overwhelming expectations that weighed him down. Expectations placed not only on him, but on the entire system of mega ministry. The system was built on image. It was built on this idea of perfection, Juanita explained, and when you can't keep it, when the strain becomes too severe, you crack. But this was not simply her view. It was the sum of years of experience witnessing others in the ministry, including herself, battle with the exact same problem. She remembered how many times she had witnessed leaders, particularly those who came to prominence in the same manner Jakes did, lose themselves in the bustle of preserving an image rather than nourishing their spiritual vocation. Her argument was that the expense of attempting to keep up with the public's expectations for perfection, the unending cycle of being on for the cameras, and the unquenchable yearning for more led to a perilous tipping point. It was no longer simply about ministry, it was about survival. Juanita's remarks pierced deep into the core of this occurrence. Leaders were becoming devoured by the very things that were designed to enhance them. In reality, Juanita's analysis was more than simply a criticism. It was a warning. The reality is, when you're in a system that requires perpetual development, constant stress, and constant visibility, you start losing touch with what actually counts. She wasn't just speaking to Jakes, but to the whole ecology of megachurches and the leaders who had let their ministries to expand into corporate-like institutions. So why did T.D. Jakes eventually step down? Juanita's response was multi-layered. T.D. Jakes stepped down because he had reached a breaking point, when the expense of the brand was too high. According to Juanita, this moment of clarity occurred after years of strain and fatigue. Jakes had constructed an empire that others would dream of, but it came with a persistent desire for excellence, for development, and for perpetual expansion. Eventually, he had to question himself, at what cost? Her second insight was much more deep. It's not just about physical tiredness. It's the mental and spiritual toll it takes when you've developed something so huge that it becomes bigger than you. This was not merely a remark on Jakes' ministry. It was a warning for other leaders who were on the same road. The reality was, many leaders like Jakes, surrounded by yes men and women, frequently have no one to criticize them, to keep them grounded. The fear of losing their success or their position might cloud their judgment, driving people to remain in jobs or settings that may no longer serve them or their purpose. Juanita had understood this fact all too well. She spoke from experience when she remarked, "You can't serve from an empty cup." Eventually, the mask collapses and the truth always makes its way to the surface. But here's where things became even more surprising. What triggered the tipping point wasn't only about Jakes approaching a breaking point, but also the pressure from the people around him. As Juanita probed more into her investigation, it became evident that there were external influences driving Jakes' choice to stand down. The politics, the gossip, the power battles behind closed doors. These were forces that, in her judgment, could not be ignored. While she detailed the problems, she built a picture of a man who had always strived to live up to the public's expectations of a spiritual leader, even while people around him were adjusting their own objectives. Juanita's statements showed that even inside the church, there are individuals who are more interested in power and control than in helping their communities. The final bombshell she unleashed was something no one could have imagined. When you reach a moment like this, you realize the people closest to you may not have been there for the right reasons. Juanita wasn't simply referring about Jakes' tight group. She was referring about the wider reality of church leadership at its highest levels. People will praise you when you're up, but when you fall, they're the first ones to turn their backs, she continued. By now, Juanita had created a disturbing vision of the reality many spiritual leaders endure. A world where their love for ministry, their calling, and their sense of self may be eaten up by the machine they've established. So what now for T.D. Jakes? As the debate took a deeper turn, Juanita Bynum started to focus on the wider picture, the legacy of T.D. Jakes, and what will happen following his leave. For many, his ministry had marked the peak of accomplishment, not only spiritually but in terms of prominence, fortune, and cultural effect. Yet, as Juanita emphasized, no legacy is without its challenges. The issue now became, what happens to the legacy of T.D. Jakes when the guy himself steps back? Juanita didn't mince words when she talked about the difficulty of leaving behind a great legacy. She likened it to a double-edged sword. A legacy is intended to be something that outlives you. But when it's based on your personality, on your name, on your own brand, it becomes a different type of weight. The weight of Jakes' legacy was not simply in the reach he had accomplished, but in the expectation put on others to fill the hole he would leave. People don't comprehend, Juanita said. When a leader like Jakes steps down, it's not only the people in the church that feel it, it's everyone in the ecosystem surrounding them. She wasn't simply talking about the millions of followers or even the team of pastors and personnel that supported his ministry. She was referring about the business world, the media, and the whole industry that had formed itself on Jakes' brand. She recognized that T.D. Jakes had developed a multi-million-dollar enterprise that reached beyond the pulpit. The Potter's House, his megachurch in Dallas, had become a cultural phenomenon. His books became bestsellers, his conferences drew thousands, and his TV appearances were viewed by millions. His appeal transcended religion. He became a household name. But the issue remained. How can a legacy endure when it's bound to one person so tightly? Juanita's viewpoint was anchored in truth, and it was apparent she thought that a meaningful legacy should not be established on the basis of one individual's persona, but on the underlying ideals of the ministry and the individuals who carry that vision forward. And yet, here's the most frightening question Juanita offered next. Is it feasible for the legacy of T.D. Jakes to survive if it was so closely linked with his brand, his image, his entire identity? This was the cliffhanger that left many wondering whether there was hope for what Jakes had achieved, or if it would ultimately fade into history as another narrative of a great leader who couldn't escape the weight of his own achievement. The ramifications on the church and the industry. Juanita then went on to explore the long-term impact Jakes' choice would have on both his congregation and the larger Christian community. When a figure like T.D. Jakes steps down, it rattles the whole core of the system, she said, emphasizing that it wasn't just about his personal ministry, but also the culture of megachurches and ministry empires that had been the norm in the previous several decades. The question of who would stand forward next appeared to hang in the air. Who could replace a leader who had constructed such a large platform? Juanita pointed out that the vacuum created by Jakes would be difficult to fill. With his departure, other pastors, leaders, and influencers would certainly face additional pressure to lead and to preserve the status quo. But here's when things got interesting. The world is changing and the church is moving with it. Juanita didn't shy away from stating that the megachurch model itself was under heavy investigation. As society develops and as people's expectations of religion and service vary, the need for flamboyant, star-driven leadership was starting to decrease. She stressed that the church was no longer primarily characterized by enormous structures or costly festivities. There was a new trend of leadership developing, one that wasn't centered on the brand of the leader, but rather on the content of the ministry itself. She referred to leaders who were concentrating on honesty, vulnerability, and meaningful connection with their congregations. Leaders who were anchored in the realities of helping others and not only promoting oneself. This is the future, Juanita replied firmly. And although Jakes has certainly constructed something spectacular, the future of the church isn't only about empire building. It's about meeting people where they are. Her message seemed plain. T.D. Jakes, for all his triumphs, was the product of a former age, a time when the church ran differently. The future would belong to those who could adapt and react to the requirements of the world today, not merely depend on the blueprint that had worked in the past. But, as she emphasized, there was also a tremendous lot of ambiguity about what that change might look like. The ripple consequences of Jakes stepping down would echo for years to come. hurting both his ministry and the broader megachurch sector. A new chapter for T.D. Jakes: redemption or retreat? Then came the question on everyone's mind. What does the future hold for T.D. Jakes himself? Juanita had an unusual view on this. She pointed out that many leaders in the religious world don't genuinely move away. Instead, they pivot into new positions or tasks. T.D. Jakes, she believed, was too significant to just vanish. He may step back from one role, but I have no doubt he'll find a way to reinvent himself, she said, adding that Jakes' next move would likely be just as strategic as everything he had done before. The idea that T.D. Jakes could reinvent himself wasn't just speculation. It was a possibility that many had already begun to entertain. In fact, Juanita believed that Jakes could redefine his legacy in a way that goes beyond the public image of a megachurch pastor. Whether through new forms of media, speaking engagements, or other endeavors, she was convinced that his story wasn't over yet. But the million-dollar question remained. Would his future endeavors be as successful as his past ones? Would he be able to adapt to the changing times? Or would his own public persona be too tightly entwined with his past identity to allow for true reinvention? As Juanita continued speaking, her words became a sobering reflection on the broader implications of leadership transitions in the church world. While much of the conversation had centered around T.D. Jakes' exit and his personal legacy, Juanita pointed out that the greater conversation wasn't just about Jakes. It was about the shifting landscape of leadership in the church, especially within the African American community. Juanita's analysis went beyond the individual. What happens to the church when the very leaders we've trusted for decades begin to step down? Her concern wasn't just about Jakes. It was about the future of the ministries that had risen in his wake. She pointed out that for many young people growing up in the church today, T.D. Jakes and other megachurch leaders were the face of religion. She emphasized that church leadership was no longer solely defined by charisma or stage presence. The need for authenticity and emotional intelligence was becoming paramount. And while many of these leaders had been trained in traditional, hierarchical systems, a new generation was beginning to ask deeper questions. Juanita spoke about the increasing call for accountability within the church. The rise of social media had allowed congregants to see their pastors and leaders in more vulnerable, human light.